Breaking news, an New Orleans City Council committee defers a proposed ordinance that would restrict the way people feed those living in homeless encampments.
Lauren McCoy has a breakdown.
Yeah, Meg and Lee, the New Orleans City Council Quality of Life Committee did decide to hold off on voting on that ordinance because members say further discussion is needed on this complex issue. Those at the meeting were passionate about making sure health and safety remains a top priority at homeless encampments, while also providing those individuals with the resources they need. Multiple council members saying the unregulated food distribution is a factor to litter and rodent issues at those encampments. The New Orleans Health Department agrees, saying people are dumping trays and plates of raw meat and boxes of rotten bananas, just to name a few there. And officials also say individuals are dumping more than just food. They're dumping furniture that have bugs and lice. And Councilmember Eugene Green wrote this proposed ordinance and says it's about regulation, not about penalizing those trying to help people living in encampments.
Let's work it out and communicate and not be enemies with each other. Some of the calls that I've gotten, some of the emails that I've gotten would make you think that members of the council wake up each morning and say, what can we do to oppress the unhoused? What can we do to oppress the homeless? Not thinking about any other facts other than their own beliefs.
People who live in housing near encampments and may walk by encampments may feel that their proximity to any health or safety issues in encampments presents them with a quality of life issue. But I really need to emphasize, for those actually living in an encampment, it is a death or life issue, not a quality of life issue.
Councilmember Leslie Harris says she wants to see a more educational campaign approach instead of imposing fines to regulate the current issues surrounding giving out food. Advocates, the city and the council all agree more resources, especially to clean up the encampments, can help and would create a better environment overall.